This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Go to the link in the description below so they know that I sent you. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and it is Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. I have been diving really deep into creature types for the last several MTG Top 10s, looking at the most and least frequent creature types and the best and worst creature types. Today, we're continuing this trend, but looking at it from another angle. My worst and best videos don't look specifically at tribal decks built around specific creature types, instead just looking at creature types on the whole. In this video, we're looking at tribal decks. What's a tribal deck, you ask? Well, it's a deck that is made up predominantly of creatures from a single type and that runs several cards that give you bonuses and payoffs for doing so. To be eligible for this list, the deck had to be at least 80% made up of the creature type in question, and it had to have at least 5 copies of cards that gave some type of tribal bonus. There have been decks in the game's history that have names that imply that they're tribal, Dragon Stompy for example, but in reality they aren't because the deck runs no copies of cards that give them bonuses for a creature type, so that's why I needed to come up with a threshold for determining what is and is not tribal. I haven't actually ever done an MTG Top 10 over decks before, but the methodology here is more or less the same as it is for looking at individual cards. Decks get 2 points for Pro Tour, Mythic Championship, Legacy, and Vintage Championship Top 8s, and 1 point for a Grand Prix Top 8. Additionally, while I will talk about different incarnations of tribal decks for the tribes on this list, I have combined the total score of each tribal deck for each tribe. In other words, zombie decks from original Innistrad Standard and Amonkhet Standard are both zombie tribal decks, so both are used to determine the score for zombie tribal. In all, there have been 17 tribes that have put up at least 1 point. In this video, we're going to look at the 10 that have had the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Now, let's get started with number 10. And number 10 is Kithkin, a creature type you may not be familiar with at all if you didn't play during Lorwyn block, since that's the last time we saw these little guys. Like most white tribes, Kithkin excel at white weenie strategies. Kithkin decks had some modest success in both block and standard. Lorwyn block was one completely built around tribes, and as a result, every creature type the set really focused on received a ton of support. There may only be 60 Kithkin in all of Magic, but several of the ones that there are offer nice tribal bonuses. Wizened Sen offers Kithkin decks a really efficient Lord, which is a great thing to have when you're just trying to curve out and kill your opponent quickly. Gold Metal Stalwart was almost always a 1-mana 2/2 in Kithkin decks. The card that was perhaps the most powerful Kithkin payoff wasn't actually a Kithkin, it was Cloud Goat Ranger, a giant who brought his Kithkin friends to the battlefield and then could use those friends to give itself flying and a stats boost until end of turn. Kithkin never took hold outside of block and standard, though I think if we start to see more of them in the future, it might be a good idea to dust off some of the key cards in this old deck. And number 9 is another white creature type, Rebels. If you watch my best creature type video, you've already heard me talk a little bit about Rebels, but I'm going to go more in depth here about how this deck worked specifically. Rebels are a creature type that broke the Masks block constructed format because they were just too good. Many Rebels, like Defiant Falcon here, had the ability to recruit other Rebels directly to the battlefield. This is an effect that quickly snowballs as it gives you massive card advantage over your opponent. In some ways, the way Rebels played was kind of like Birthing Pod in that the goal was to chain higher and higher in terms of converted mana cost in your deck until you won the game. Rebel decks generally didn't win with a combo like Birthing Pod, instead just winning with a board loaded up with Rebels. This whole theme made cards that generally aren't very good, like Joval Queen, actually worth running in this deck because it wasn't that hard to get to the point where you could recruit her. The thing that makes Rebels so strong is that the vast majority of them are tribal payoffs because of that recruitability. The best Rebel of them all was Lyn Civi Defiant Hero, and it was her presence that broke the format. She could search up any Rebel she wanted to, and could even put Rebels that you wanted to recruit again back in your library. Rebel decks dominated the Block Pro Tour for Masks block constructed, putting up 6 top 8s at that event. After that, Lyn Civi was banned from the format, and this weakened Rebels enough. Rebels also saw a bit of play in Standard, but Block is where they found most of their success. The crazy thing about Rebels is that they pretty much only thrived in the year 2000, but they did enough in that short span of time to make this list, as well as the best creature types list from earlier this week. At number 8 are Dragons. For a long time, Dragon Tribal was a hard thing to make work. Wizards had tried to push it a few times before, like an Onslaught block, but it never really worked out. Most tribal decks are aggro decks that look to just curve out and kill the opponent before they can find their footing, and dragons tend to have rather high converted mana costs, making this strategy not really make sense for them. In Tarkir block, Wizards really pushed Dragon Tribal and they took it in an interesting direction. Decks were filled with Dragon payoffs for sure, but the Dragon decks out there were largely control decks. This made sense because Dragons were still pretty expensive in this block. Of all the Dragon control decks of Tarkir Standard, Esper Dragons was probably the most successful. These decks ran big scary dragons as their win condition, and there was no shortage of those in Tarkir block, like Silumgar the Drifting Death, who also happened to be a dragon payoff on its own. Tarkir block also introduced several spells that gave you bonuses for having a dragon in your hand or on the battlefield, such as Foul Tongue Invocation, which gained you life if you met that requirement, or Silumgar's Scorn, which costs less if you meet it. The next most successful dragon deck of the time was probably Gruul Dragons, which had a lower curve and was more mid-rangey than the Esper deck. One of the key dragon payoffs in this deck was Thunderbreak Regent, which punished opponents who killed your dragons. The deck also had access to the powerful removal spell Draconic Roar, which also damaged the opponent if you had a dragon in your hand or on the battlefield. Dragon decks were ubiquitous and powerful in the Standard of 2015 and 2016, and they make it on this list solely from that success. At number 7 are Zombies, the representative race for Black. Spoiler alert, all 5 creature types that Wizards has designated as representative races for each color are going to appear on this list. And this really shouldn't come as a surprise. These are the creature types that Wizards considers as emblematic of specific colors, and as a result they appear on multiple planes and have received tribal support on multiple occasions, giving them an edge over lots of creature types. Zombies have received a heavy tribal push in 4 different blocks. This includes Onslaught, Innistrad, Shadows over Innistrad, and Amonkhet. While a zombie deck never managed to materialize an Onslaught block or Standard, every other time they have received serious support, they have gone on to be a relevant deck in the Standard they were a part of. This first occurred in 2012 with our first trip to Innistrad. On this Gothic-inspired plane, the blue-black color pair was defined largely by the zombie creature type, with Diregraph Captain giving zombies a powerful lord who not only gives an anthem to your zombies, but punishes your opponent every time one of them dies. Perhaps the biggest tribal payoff for this deck, though, was Gravecrawler, a zombie who refused to stay in the graveyard provided you had a zombie in play. Sure, he can't block and he's small, but when he refuses to stay dead and is pumped by a lord, that's a bit of a problem for your opponent, especially because these decks usually ran some sacrifice effects too, meaning there was also a reason to bring your Gravecrawler back every single turn. Zombies went quiet for a while after they rotated out of Standard, but they came back in full force when 2 blocks that had heavy zombie themes were both in Standard at the same time, Shadows over Innistrad and Amonkhet. While the zombie decks of original Innistrad Standard had zombie payoffs, the zombie decks of the Standard of 2017 had even more, with almost every creature in the deck offering some sort of zombie payoff. Lord of the Accursed provided a lord that could give zombies menace in addition to a stats boost. Cryptbreaker could make both zombie tokens and use zombies to draw additional cards, and Diregraph Colossus liked for there to be zombies in the graveyard, and also liked it when you played zombies while he was in play. This is by no means an exhaustive listing of the zombie payoffs in this deck, just a list of the ones that I think were the most impactful. This zombie deck was unfortunately short-lived, because the 2 sets were only in Standard at the same time for a few months, but that might be a good thing, because this deck was pretty powerful. I think we can count on zombies receiving more tribal support in the future and adding to their score. At number 6, we have Goblins, the representative race for Red. Goblins had intermittently received tribal support since the game began, but it didn't receive its first sustained push towards a tribal deck until Onslaught block in 2002. Goblins were a big part of why Onslaught Zombies never really caught on, because Goblins received insane support and could win games incredibly quickly. Goblin Warchief was a key card in the deck as he both reduced the cost of all of your goblins and gave them haste, 2 things that when combined together enabled your deck to move incredibly quickly. Other Goblin powerhouses from the time include Goblin Piledriver, who got increasingly larger the more goblins you attacked with, and Siege Gang Commander, who brought a bunch of goblins to the party and then could chuck them at your opponent or your opponent's creatures. The core of these Goblin decks was so powerful that it enabled Goblin decks not only in Block and Standard, but even in Extended and Legacy, where decks also had access to Goblin Lackey, who let you put goblins into play for free if you made contact with your opponent. One thing you may have noticed about all of this is that 3 of the cards I mentioned, Goblin Warchief, Goblin Piledriver, and Siege Gang Commander, have all recently been reprinted, so we may be about to see a resurgence of goblins in Modern. At number 5, we have Merfolk, our third consecutive representative race, with Merfolk, of course, being the one for blue. Like Goblins, Merfolk have received tribal support since the game began, and some early decks calling themselves Merfolk decks were around, but the only tribal payoff they had was Lord of Atlantis, so I didn't consider them true tribal decks. Merfolk finally received a strong push in Lorwyn block, where they were the tribe for the blue-white color pair. Lorwyn brought a new Merfolk lord to the table in Marrow Regery at a time when Lord of Atlantis was still legal in Standard, giving the deck 8 lords. I know this sounds like a lot, but Merfolk decks eventually far exceed 8 copies of lords, and that's part of what makes them so powerful. Later Merfolk decks also received Coralhelm Commander, an efficient creature who could level up into a Merfolk lord, and Merfolk Sovereign, a Merfolk lord who could also make them unblockable. With all of these lords, Merfolk decks have proven to be multi-format juggernauts, and they are helped by the fact that they play blue, meaning that the deck can transition well into eternal formats, where it is important to be able to play powerful counter magic like Force of Will. Merfolk did receive some more payoffs in Ixalan block, where the blue-green color pair was occupied largely by Merfolk, but it doesn't look like Merfolk tribal decks are really going to take off in our current Standard. But that's probably okay for Merfolk, who are still very viable decks in Legacy and Modern. At number 4, we have Humans, our fourth consecutive representative race to make the list. As we've discussed in the other creature type videos, humans are the most plentiful creature type in the entire game, and they appear in all colors with regularity, and as a result, they have a massive pool of cards to choose from. However, even though they are the most common creature type in the game, they have actually only received a powerful tribal bush 2 times on both of our visits to Innistrad, where the green-white color pair was largely defined by humans. On the first trip to Innistrad, Champion of the Parish provided a powerful human payoff and a cheap creature that just got larger as the game went on. There were also Reanimator decks built entirely around Angel of Glory's Rise, who paid you off for having a graveyard loaded up with humans. The second time we went to Innistrad, we were given Thalia's Lieutenant, who likes it when humans are already on the battlefield when it comes down, but also likes it when humans are played after it hits the battlefield. When Ixalan was released, humans weren't technically a supported tribe, but the set had a tribal theme, and as a result, one of the cards printed to enable that was Unclaimed Territory. As I noted already, humans are plentiful and occur across multiple colors, and the printing of Unclaimed Territory, which could be played alongside Cavern of Souls and Ancient Ziggurat, gave 5-color human decks insanely good mana bases in Modern, and as a result, Modern Humans has emerged as one of the most powerful decks in the format, because now the deck could run really good human payoffs like Thalia's Lieutenant and Champion of the Parish, and then just jam all the best humans around into the deck regardless of their colors. I think Humans is going to continue to thrive in Modern going forward. At number 3, we have Elves, our fifth and final representative race to make the list. Elves received considerable tribal support for the first time in Onslaught block, but like zombies, they kind of got crowded out by the fact that Goblin decks were just so much better. It wasn't until Lorwyn that Elves received another block's worth of support, with the black-green color pair in those sets being occupied by Elves. It was here that they received Imperious Perfect, an elf lord who can also make elf tokens, who, obviously enough, Imperious Perfect also pumps. Another powerful elf payoff was Ren's Run Packmaster, who, for the low cost of championing an elf, gave you a 4-mana 5/5 who could churn out wolf tokens that have Death Touch. Lorwyn block also gave elf players Heritage Druid, who can produce absurd amounts of mana with some other elves in play. While Elves found some success in the block and standard formats surrounding Lorwyn block, new elf payoffs from that block were combined with the mostly forgotten elf payoffs of Onslaught to make a powerful deck in formats like Extended, Legacy, and Modern. Decks in those formats seek to use Heritage Druid and other mana elves together, combined with various untap effects, to generate enormous amounts of mana and get tons of elves in play before winning the game with the Zuri Renegade Leader, who can make an elf-heavy board lethal in a hurry when you have a ton of mana. At number 2 are Fairies. Like a lot of tribes who made this list, Fairies received a ton of tribal support in Lorwyn block, and this came after really not having any in the entire history of Magic. Just like Goblin decks turned out to be far and away the strongest of the tribes in Onslaught, Fairies did the same in Lorwyn block and Standard. Fairies in Lorwyn occupied the blue-black color pair and received incredibly powerful support that allowed them to find their way into other formats too. Scion of Una gave you a powerful lord who gave Shroud to your other Fairies, and it had Flash, so that meant you could flash it in response to a removal spell to counter it, while also pumping your entire board. Spell Stutter Sprite gave you a powerful counterspell that came with an evasive body, and Miss Spine Click essentially gave you a way to time walk your opponent by tapping down their lands. The fact that Fairies are in blue, and so many of the best ones have Flash, means that you can often leave mana up for counter magic and be ready to use it, but if your opponent tried to play around it, you just get to flash in an invasive creature, threatening their life total immediately. Fairy decks built around this core also found their way into Modern and Extended. Fairies haven't seen play in a while though, so if some of the other tribes behind it receive some support in standard legal sets in the near future, its place on this list could be in danger. And at number 1 we have Eldrazi. Eldrazi first appeared in Zendikar block, and when they did, they immediately received a bit of tribal support with the printing of both Eye of Ugin and Eldrazi Temple, which could significantly reduce the cost of Eldrazi. Back in original Zendikar block, most of the cheap Eldrazi were nothing special, and even with these, the super expensive Eldrazi were still a challenge to cast. There were some decks built around the 2 lands in that standard format, and they did find a bit of success. However, it was our second trip to Zendikar that Eldrazi were printed who could really abuse these 2 Eldrazi lands. Among them were cards like Eldrazi Mimic, who while not technically an Eldrazi payoff, essentially is because there are only so many creature types that are colorless. Now, if you had Eye of Ugin in play, your Mimic was free. Then you could play some big scary Eldrazi on subsequent turns for huge discounts, and the Mimic would hit harder and harder. The Mimic and other cheap Eldrazi printed in Battle for Zendikar block made Eldrazi the undisputed best deck in all of Modern, and eventually Eye of Ugin had to get banned to get that situation under control. However, Eldrazi aggro decks still thrive in Legacy and Vintage, where they can still play both of these powerful Eldrazi payoff lands. Well, that does it for today's MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to see some of my other 180 MTG Top 10s, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.